Hey guys, tonight we're not so much traveling through time as slipping through its cracks. You're not walking a clean museum hallway. You're tiptoeing across the attic floorboards of history, dusty, dark, full of objects no one labeled properly, and events no one fully understands. There's a courtroom in England where everyone who entered started dying. A forgotten empire that once ruled the mountains of Armenia, then just vanished. A star map from the Bronze Age that somehow gets the constellations exactly right. And a book that might have been written by the devil or by no one at all. You're not meant to solve any of this. That's not the point. You're here to float in it, to let the strangeness wash over you like warm fog. History isn't always a series of facts. Sometimes it's just a set of beautiful, unanswered questions. And yes, if you tried to live in half of these stories, you probably wouldn't survive the night. Not without a medieval antidote made of lizard powder and wine, or a good luck charm shaped like a 12-sided Roman mystery object. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and what time you're watching this. I love seeing where you all are tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you feel is the wind. Dry and high and cold. You're standing among the peaks of what we now call Eastern Turkey, but back then, around 900 BC, this wasn't a place that looked backward. It was the future. Stone walls stretch out before you, thick and deliberate with inscriptions you can't read, but they're sharp, clean, not worn away by time. This was a capital once, the capital of Urartu. Never heard of it. That's not your fault. History buried it. Urartu was a kingdom of mountaintop fortresses, bronze weapons, and surprisingly advanced engineering. The Assyrians feared it. The Hebrews may have remembered it in their flood myths. Its people built aqueducts before the Romans did, and carved inscriptions in a language still only half understood. You duck beneath a stone lintel and find a dry tunnel still intact. There's a small shrine at the end with two eye-shaped carvings. It's oddly peaceful here, but you can't help wondering, why did they vanish? Historians still argue whether it was the Medes, the Scythians, or a long, slow unraveling from internal decay. What's strange is that the fall of Urartu didn't leave much cultural trace. No great ruins being repurposed by successors, no continuation of royal bloodlines. Just silence. What little we know comes from their enemies, the Assyrians, who wrote about Urartu's horses, its defenses, its raids. But it's like reading a biography written by someone who wanted you dead. And then there's the Lake Van Fortress, still standing, still watching. You feel the stones and realize they weren't trying to impress. They were trying to endure. There's even a theory, just one on the dusty fringes of academia, that Urartu didn't fall so much as change names. Some scholars think it quietly evolved into Armenia itself. Others dismiss that idea entirely, saying the cultural break is too sharp, the language too different. You sit on a stone bench, wind still brushing your shoulders. If Urartu is remembered at all, it's remembered as a shadow, a place behind the mountains, a word in someone else's language. And as the sky darkens around those old walls, you realize sometimes history doesn't vanish. It just goes quiet. You're still among mountains, but they're grayer now, softer in outline. The stone has traded jagged strength for a kind of mossy rot. You hear distant bells, church bells, but the scene before you is anything but holy. You're standing in Oxford, England. The year is 1577. The courtroom is packed. Judges in velvet robes, scribes dipping their quills, prisoners shackled at the wrists. It looks like a normal trial, grim but procedural. Except this one will kill over 300 people. Not through sword or gallows, but with breath, with presence. This is the Black Assize of Oxford, and no one really knows what happened. Here's what we do know during that summer session, following a particularly rowdy set of hearings involving prisoners accused of murder and rebellion, a wave of sudden illness swept through the courtroom. Judges, jurors, clerks, even onlookers began falling ill within hours, many of them dead within days. You step outside the courtroom now and smell it damp wood mildew, a faint acidic tang like rotting paper. It's not hard to imagine air heavy with something unclean. But what? The records say it started with violent vomiting and fever. Some collapsed before they left the building. Others made it home only to die in bed. By the end of the outbreak, more than 300 were dead, including the presiding judge himself. Historians still argue whether it was typhus the plague or even some kind of environmental toxin. But here's the twist: the prisoners shackled in the cells below survived. Some thought it was a curse, possibly cast by a Romani woman, tried that same week. Others suspected divine punishment or a miasma rising from the undercrofts, stirred by too many bodies pressed into too tight a space. You walk into the crypt beneath the courtroom. It's colder here, the stone sweating slightly, like it remembers the bodies that once piled up. In later years, people would say the walls had absorbed the deaths, that the courthouse itself had become unclean. But here's the real mystery. This wasn't the first time Oxford had suffered a black assize. The same thing happened in 1350. And again in 1577. Could it be architectural? Was something in the building's design trapping bacteria? Or did the repeated legal cruelty from witch trials to political executions create something darker? You glance at the walls. They're layered in limewash, but beneath older bricks peek out. The city has tried to clean this place, sterilize it, but the story always returns. There's even a legend that Queen Elizabeth the Wine herself asked about the deaths, worried that the sickness of sin was rising from the court. Not a metaphor, a literal airborne sin. You step back into the courtroom and imagine the air as it must have been thick, unventilated, full of sweat and old breath and the slow rot of British summer. And for a moment, it almost feels heavy. Whatever it was, it didn't stop court from continuing. Trials resumed, sentences were passed, but the black assize remained a whispered warning for centuries after. Even today, modern ghost tours in Oxford pause outside the courthouse and lower their voices. Not for effect, but for respect. They say you shouldn't speak too loudly near the steps. You might wake something. And here's a final, almost absurd detail when the court was eventually renovated. In the 1800s, workers claimed to find old bones walled into the foundation. One even claimed to see a finger still pointing upward, as if trying to finish giving testimony. Whether that's true or not, the courtroom stands. The bell still rings. But the air, you'd be forgiven for holding your breath. Because history doesn't always leave ghosts behind. Sometimes it just leaves the feeling that breathing might be dangerous. You're in France now. The year is 1212, and what you see before you would be touching if it weren't so utterly tragic. A boy stands on a barrel in a dusty town square calling to the crowd. His name might be Stephen, or Nicholas, or something else entirely, because depending on which chronicler you believe, the Children's Crusade happened in a dozen different ways. But the one thing everyone agrees on, there were children, and they were walking toward the Holy Land. You hear the shuffle of bare feet, the clink of wooden crosses, the sniffling of kids no older than 12 or 13. They carry bread crusts, scraps of cheese, and the kind of faith only children have, bright, absolute, and terrifying in its simplicity. They're marching because they've been told they must, because they believe they can succeed where armies of men failed. According to one version, a boy in France received visions from Jesus himself. According to another, a shepherd boy in Germany claimed that the sea would part before him. Spoiler, it didn't. Historians still argue whether the Children's Crusade was real or an exaggerated patchwork of separate events that got folded together later. Some think it was a grassroots pilgrimage movement born of desperation and innocence. Others argue it was a social panic invented by adult chroniclers, shocked to see mobs of unsupervised children. But there are documents, letters from bishops' tax records, even ship manifests that suggest something did happen. Something that moved hundreds, maybe thousands of young people from the villages of France and Germany all the way to the southern ports of Europe. And here's where it gets cruel. Some of those children never made it out of the Alps. Others reaching the coast were allegedly sold into slavery by unscrupulous ship captains. The records say 2 ships sank off the coast of Sardinia, killing nearly all on board. There's a horrible irony in how many adults, kings, priests, merchants stood by as children walked past blessing them, or laughing, or ignoring them entirely. Some even profited from them. You follow the trail down a rocky hill where the group once passed. It's quiet now, but you imagine the line of them, some barefoot, some singing hymns, others just looking for food. Not warriors, not soldiers, just believers. It's hard not to romanticize it. That's why modern books and films have tried to frame it as noble, spiritual, even hopeful. But you pause and remember the numbers. Hundreds dead, more than 1,000 missing, and no army ever reached Jerusalem. There's a Latin phrase from the time, pueri non sunt pueri. The children are not children. Some historians suggest the phrase was used to dismiss the story entirely, to claim these weren't real children, but metaphorical children of faith, or even adult heretics disguised as pilgrims. Others think it was just a way for officials to shrug off the responsibility. You sit by a fountain in Marseille, where one wave of the children's crusade is said to have ended. There are carvings on the stones, weathered faces, sea creatures, and waves. You wonder if any of the missing ships ever sailed from this very dock. One theory pushed by medieval critics was that Satan had inspired the march, that false visions lured the children not to salvation, but to destruction. Convenient, isn't it, blame the devil, and you don't have to ask what kind of society lets children die on religious errands. But there's another way to see it. Not as mass delusion, but mass hope. In a world crushed by war, famine, and plague, maybe the only thing left to believe in was the ability of innocence to move mountains. And that makes you think, if the children's crusade happened today, would we let them walk? Or would we tell them to stay home, go to school, grow up first? And maybe that's the problem, because if you believe you can part the sea, you don't wait for permission. You're not in a church, you're not at a festival, you're not watching a performance. You're in the middle of a street in Strasbourg, and people are dancing themselves to death. It's 1518, and the cobblestones are slick with sweat and blood. The first woman begins it. Her name is lost to history, but she steps into the street and begins to dance. No music, no partner, no explanation. She just moves. And then, she doesn't stop. You watch as neighbors come out of their homes first to stare, then to scold, then to join. Within days, dozens are moving, jerking, stomping, spinning. By the end of the week, over 400 people are locked in this unending, unchosen ritual. You think it must be some kind of celebration, right? But their faces say otherwise. Grimaces, exhaustion. Some fall, some bleed. Some collapse and are dragged off by relatives. Others just keep going. Historians still argue whether it was mass hysteria, ergot poisoning from tainted rye, or even an ancient pagan possession buried beneath layers of Christian Europe. You smell bread baking in a nearby oven. A detail that sounds mundane until you realize that the same ovens may have housed the moldy grain that some believe caused this madness. Ergot, after all, produces hallucinations. It's chemically related to LSD. But here's the problem with that theory: not everyone was eating the same bread. And when tested, centuries later, no trace of ergot was found in local records or fields. So you consider hysteria. Group psychosis, a stress response. Because Strasbourg in 1518 wasn't peaceful, it was hungry, hot, and on the verge of another round of religious purges. People were terrified. Maybe this was how their terror got out. But still, how does fear make people dance for 6 days without rest? without control. Some reports say a dozen people died of exhaustion, heart failure, or stroke. One priest wrote that the devil had loosed a rhythm upon the town, and only prayer could silence it. The city council wasn't so spiritual. They hired musicians. That's right, they literally brought in a band, built a stage, and hoped the dancers would tire themselves out faster with accompaniment. Spoiler, it didn't work. Later, they tried the opposite approach, removing music, isolating dancers, sending them to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, patron of epilepsy, and oddly enough, of dancing. There they prayed, fasted, and some say finally stopped moving. But you're not convinced. The shadows of those dancers still feel close, like the rhythm hasn't entirely faded. You take a breath and lean against a wooden door frame watching the empty street. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the stomp, the shuffle, the panting. You wonder what really happened inside those bodies. Was it spiritual, chemical, cultural? And the weirdest thing, Strasbourg wasn't alone. Similar dance plagues broke out across the Middle Ages, from Aachen to Basel to the Netherlands. One even occurred on a bridge, and several dancers fell to their deaths. What makes people do this? Modern researchers suggest a phenomenon called motor release, where extreme stress causes involuntary bodily movement magnified by group dynamics. Sounds clinical, cold, but it doesn't explain the chanting, or the fact that some seemed entranced, or that others watched and joined. What if the human brain, pressed to its limit, doesn't always scream or cry, but dances? What if movement is the mind's emergency exit? You walk away from the square, but not quickly. Your steps feel a little rhythmic, just a tiny bit too in sync with the echoes of history. You wonder if it happened again, if someone started dancing today on a subway platform or in the middle of Times Square. Would we medicate them, film them, hashtag it? Or would we understand that sometimes history doesn't repeat itself? It just taps you on the shoulder and starts counting the beat. Now you're riding the wind. Not metaphorically, you're quite literally in the saddle, galloping across the endless steppe under a low orange sun. The year somewhere between the 7th and 10th centuries. The place, a wide swath of land between the Caspian and Black Seas. You've entered the realm of the Khazar Empire. Never heard of it. Don't worry, you're not alone. Even most history buffs raise an eyebrow at the name. But once upon a time, the Khazars held the crossroads of empires. They taxed Silk Road caravans, played Byzantium and the caliphates against each other, and maintained a multicultural society of Christians, Muslims, and most famously Jews. Yes, this medieval steppe empire made up of Turkic nomads reportedly converted its ruling elite to Judaism sometime in the 8th century. And that right there is where the mysteries begin. You pull up at a stone fort on the banks of the Volga River. It's sturdy, impressive, and utterly empty. No inscriptions, no archives, no gold seals proclaiming their faith or allegiance. Most of what we know comes from other people's letters. One of the most famous sources is a correspondence between Khazar King Joseph and a Jewish dignitary in Spain known as the Khazar Correspondence. The king explains that his people chose Judaism after reviewing the beliefs of Christians and Muslims and deciding that the original path was best. It sounds almost too neat, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether this was a sincere conversion, a political maneuver, or even a total fabrication. Some suspect it was a savvy strategy to remain neutral between the Christian Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates, neither of which would have been thrilled if the Khazars had joined the other's faith. There's also debate over how many Khazars actually converted. Was it just the elite? The whole population? A performative gesture. And then there's the aftershock. For centuries, theories have swirled, some scholarly, some conspiratorial, claiming that modern Ashkenazi Jews descend from the Khazars. Most genetic evidence now contradicts this, but the myth still lingers in corners of internet pseudo-history and the occasional fringe political rant. You pass a ruined outpost. Horses used to water here. Markets once buzzed with chatter in dozens of tongues: Arabic, Persian, Slavic, Greek, Old Turkic, and Hebrew. The Khazars didn't just survive, they thrived on diversity diplomacy and strategic invisibility. So how did they disappear? Well, it wasn't instant. Their decline came in waves. The Rus' early Slavic Vikings raided their cities and disrupted trade. The Islamic world turned its roots southward. The Byzantines lost interest. And like sand through fingers, the Khazar Empire eroded into silence. There are no epic battle records, no flaming final stand, just gone. You crouch near the base of an ancient earthwork fortification. A breeze whistles past. Some archaeologists say there are bones beneath your feet, possibly Khazar, possibly not. They were cremators, so identifying remains is near impossible. And that's the irony. For a people who once sat at the nexus of empires, who may have hosted one of the most unusual religious shifts in medieval history, the Khazars left almost nothing behind. No epic poems, no buildings still standing, no cathedral ruins. Not even their capital, Atil, has been definitively located. You run your hand along the worn stones, trying to imagine a synagogue out here, amidst the steppe grass and caravans. Maybe they prayed facing Jerusalem. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they reimagined what it meant to be Jewish, out here far from Judea, in a world of trade routes and horse archers. What remains are the questions. Were the Khazars truly devout opportunists, survivors, visionaries, or were they just a strange flicker in the long-burning candle of history, a light that shimmered for a moment and then quietly faded out? You mount your horse again and ride onward, wind whipping past, as if trying to erase their tracks all over again. You wake to darkness. Not metaphorical, real physical darkness. The kind that makes noon look like twilight and casts long shadows at dawn. The year is 536 CE, and something very strange is happening to the sky. You rub your eyes expecting the morning light. But instead, there's a kind of dusty haze everywhere. The sun has a bluish hue. Crops aren't growing. People are whispering that it's the end of the world. Welcome to what some historians call the worst year to be alive. It starts subtly cooler, wins a few weeks of unusual weather. But then, the summer fails. In Constantinople, the chronicler Procopius writes that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. And it stays that way for 18 months. You wander into a village square. No fires burn. There's not enough wood. No food simmers in pots. The fields are barren, and the people, gaunt, listless, are waiting for something to change. And it doesn't. Temperatures drop across the northern hemisphere. Snow falls in China in summer. In Ireland, famine records skyrocket. Even in Central America, drought and crop failure take hold. Historians still argue what exactly caused this year of catastrophe. The most accepted theory: a massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland or somewhere near the equator. The eruption would have thrown so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere that global sunlight levels dropped, triggering a cascade of climate chaos. But it gets worse. Because just a few years later, in 541, the plague of Justinian hits one of the deadliest pandemics in history. Some estimate it killed up to 50 million people, possibly half the population of Europe and the Mediterranean. And many scholars think the weakened immune system's malnourishment and population shifts caused by the 536 event helped pave the way. You crouch beside a dry well and stare at the dust gathering in its corners. No water, no reflection, just absence. What's eerie is how little people of the time understood it. There were no meteorological maps, no satellite data, no knowledge of volcanoes causing global dimming. All they had were the symptoms and the stories. In some chronicles, it's divine punishment. In others, it's blamed on comets, celestial dragons, or a mist sent by God. You can almost hear the confusion, the sermons, the desperate prayers. And yet, there's a strange beauty to the resilience. Societies didn't collapse overnight. Farmers kept planting even when nothing grew. Monks kept copying texts by candlelight even when the ink froze. You walk through what remains of a Byzantine fort abandoned halfway through construction. Too cold to finish. Too few workers left alive. Later studies of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica confirmed a spike in volcanic debris around this time. One recent study even found microscopic particles from tropical volcanoes preserved in tree rings. It's like the Earth marked the trauma in its skin. What's wild is that this wasn't a single eruption. It may have been a 1-2 punch with another volcano exploding just a few years later. Imagine the planet trying to recover from one gut punch only to get knocked down again. You wonder what it felt like to be a child during this time. Growing up thinking the sun just looked like that. That summers were always cold. That your stomach was always supposed to ache from hunger. And you start to realize the worst year to be alive wasn't about a single catastrophe. It was about how long it dragged on. How normal the suffering began to feel. We look back at 536 and call it the dark year. But maybe for them it was just Tuesday. There's a theory on the fringes, but worth mentioning that the 536 event contributed to the collapse of entire civilizations, the decline of the Sasanian Empire, the retreat of the Eastern Romans, the migrations of steppe peoples. Historians still debate whether the darkness of 536 truly caused all this or just revealed how fragile everything already was. You leave the well and step into the fading dusk, even though it's midday. The air feels thinner. Time moves slower. And in that gloom, you understand history doesn't always fall in a blaze. Sometimes it withers, without ever being seen clearly again. You blink, and the darkness lifts just a little. Now you're in Alexandria, Egypt, but not the Alexandria you expect. The scrolls are gone. The Great Library is already a legend. And instead of philosophers in white robes, you're surrounded by soldiers. Dust clings to their sandals. Their faces are drawn tight. It's 415 CE, and the streets are on the verge of something loud and fast and furious. This is the setting for the Hypatian Revolt, but this isn't your usual political uprising. This is the kind of rebellion that grows out of fear, religious tension, and a thirst for scapegoats. You find yourself in a city at war with itself. On one side, the Christian bishop Cyril, backed by an increasingly aggressive mob. On the other, Hypatia, philosopher, astronomer, mathematician, and one of the last public intellectuals of the Neoplatonist school. She's brilliant, respected, resented. Hypatia teaches publicly, men and women alike. She's a pagan in a city that's turning aggressively Christian. She writes about celestial mechanics, invents tools to model planetary motion, and holds authority in a way that challenges the rising power of the church. And to some, that makes her dangerous. You walk past the agora where she once lectured. There's still dust on the steps. Her students adored her, and the governor Orestes trusted her counsel. But that alliance is what likely doomed her. Historians still argue whether Hypatia was murdered for political reasons, religious ones, or simply because angry men feared an educated woman with power. But the facts are brutal. She was dragged from her chariot by a mob, stripped, beaten, killed. What happened to her body afterward is the stuff of whispered horror. The bishop Cyril would later be canonized. Hypatia would become a symbol of reason destroyed by zealotry, of science crushed beneath the wheel of power. But there's something deeper here. You step into the ruins of an old lecture hall and imagine her voice echoing, calm, curious, precise. She wasn't preaching rebellion. She wasn't plotting against anyone. She was just teaching, and for that, she became an enemy of the state. In a way, the Hypatian Revolt isn't just about Hypatia. It's about the transition from classical antiquity to the medieval world, from open debate to doctrinal certainty, from observation to orthodoxy. Cyril's faction didn't want to debate the stars. They wanted a world with clear answers handed down from above. Hypatia represented a kind of freedom they couldn't tolerate. And that's the part that stings. Because you realize how fragile that freedom was. How quickly an entire intellectual tradition can be erased not by fire or flood, but by fear. You glance at a column, one of the few still standing. Carved into it are faint grooves. Someone once used this spot to teach planetary motion. It's not Hypatia's writing, but it might have been inspired by her. Some modern historians try to downplay the symbolism. They say Hypatia's death, while tragic, wasn't the end of rationalism. That science moved on. That philosophy survived. Maybe that's true, but tonight, under this broken arch, it sure doesn't feel like survival. It feels like a quiet obliteration. You stand in the silence where a voice used to be, and in that stillness, you hear the question she never got to answer. What if the stars could have saved us if only we had listened? You're in the attic of your own mind now, a place where the air smells like dry paper and forgotten thoughts. But outside, something bigger is happening. A cultural amnesia. A blank page where there used to be volumes. This is the Great Forgetting. It's not a single event. No one stormed a castle and burned every scroll. There was no headline that read, "Civilization erases itself today." And yet, somehow vast amounts of knowledge just slipped away. You peer into a dusty cabinet. Inside, recipes, herbal cures, navigation tricks, folk stories, names of stars that don't appear on modern maps. They're all still here, just illegible. Not because we lost the books, but because we lost the meaning. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the early medieval period, Europe entered a phase historians politely call the Dark Ages. But that name is misleading. It wasn't pitch black, there were flickers of light everywhere. What disappeared wasn't all knowledge, just certain kinds, like how to make Roman concrete that hardens underwater, or how the Antikythera mechanism predicted eclipses centuries in advance, or how to read the Etruscan language, or even how the pyramids were really built, not the grand ones, but the precise ones, the ones aligned to stars. You sit beside a monk in a 9th century scriptorium. His candle flickers as he copies the Book of Psalms for the 50th time. He's not malicious. He just doesn't have the scroll on hydraulics or the treatise on surgical tools. No one gave them to him. No one remembered to. Historians still argue whether this forgetting was natural or engineered. Was it a byproduct of war, plague, and famine, or did rising authorities deliberately erase things that challenged their worldview? The Christian Church rose in influence during this time, and with it came a narrowing of acceptable knowledge. Pagan texts were hidden, destroyed, or quietly ignored. Oral traditions weren't written down. Local dialects were dismissed as barbaric. Imagine this: you're a 10th century traveler who discovers a Roman aqueduct and marvels at how water still flows uphill. You don't know it's gravity-fed. You just think it's magic. So you build a shrine. And now, what was once engineering becomes mythology. The Great Forgetting isn't just about technology, it's about context, about losing the why behind the what. You flip open an old herbalist's book and see a recipe for fever willow bark steeped in vinegar. It works, aspirin is derived from willow bark. But the reason for using it, long forgotten. The knowledge survived. The science vanished. There are records of medieval builders stumbling upon older structures and assuming they were built by giants or demons or even angels. One stonemason's journal from the 1100s describes finding a Roman wall so precisely fitted that he refused to believe human hands had shaped it. And can you blame him? When the chain of knowledge breaks, what came before looks like magic. You didn't forget your civilization did. Modern archaeologists and historians are still piecing together clues. In remote monasteries, they've found palimpsests, pages where older texts were scraped off and replaced with scripture. With modern imaging, we can sometimes read the original writing underneath. You wonder how many lost ideas are still hiding in plain sight. Then, there's the oral side, the stories passed down through generations, but twisted over time. A migration becomes a monster tale. A natural disaster becomes divine punishment. An explorer becomes a god. The Polynesian navigation methods, for example, relied on wave patterns, bird flights, star positions, and cloud shapes. For centuries, Western scholars dismissed them as primitive. Only recently did we realize they were navigating thousands of miles without instruments. That's not myth, that's knowledge. You sit by a hearth where a grandmother tells her grandchildren about the time her people walked across the sea. She's referencing a land bridge now long submerged. But to her, it's just family history. How much have we turned into metaphor because we forgot it was once real? You pull down a book from the attic shelf. It's blank. Not because it never had words, but because time smudged them out. Ink faded. Context withered. The great forgetting isn't about villains. It's about attrition, decay, misplaced priorities. And that makes it all the more haunting. Because you realize forgetting doesn't always feel like disaster. Sometimes it feels like progress. You invent a new system, a new language, a new story, and leave the old one behind. You stop asking how things were done, because now you're doing things differently. And one day, someone stands where you once stood, looks around and says, "Who built this?" And no one knows. You wake up with a question echoing in your head. Where are all the women, not just in statues or footnotes, not just as queens and mothers, but in the day-to-day running of history? You find yourself in an archive, a quiet one. No alarms, no footsteps, just drawers full of documents, maps, paintings, and censored margins. Welcome to the chapter nobody taught you in school, the erased women of history. You crack open a ledger from a medieval guild and find something strange. A name clearly female is crossed out and replaced with a man's. But look closer. The handwriting's the same. The techniques, identical. The product still signed by her symbol. You keep digging. There's Hypatia, of course, whose brutal death you remember from Alexandria. But she's just the beginning. For every Hypatia, there's a Troda of Salerno teaching medicine to noblewomen in 11th century Italy. A Hildegard of Bingen writing cosmology and composing music while advising emperors. And then quietly you notice how many disappear. Historians still argue whether women were fully shut out of the historical record or simply forgotten over time. The answer, of course, is both. Records were often kept by men in male-run institutions. If a woman made waves in science or art or statecraft, she had to fight to be acknowledged and then fight again to be remembered. Sometimes they weren't erased maliciously. They were just overwritten. A woman ran a workshop, but her husband's name was the one etched on the door. A nun developed herbal remedies, but the monk transcribed them as his own. In Renaissance, Florence, you stumble into the workshop of Plautilla Nelli, a nun who painted massive biblical scenes. Her work was signed only by a woman, as if that were enough. For centuries, her canvases were stored unsigned, misattributed to male artists. You look at one now. The brushstrokes are fluid, the composition masterful. She knew exactly what she was doing. But for 400 years, no one asked who she was. Then there's the women who weren't just erased, they were credited to someone else. Fanny Mendelssohn wrote hundreds of musical compositions, many of which were published under her brother Felix's name. Judith Leyster, a Dutch painter, was so skilled that her works were once thought to be by Frans Hals, until someone noticed the monogram in the corner. You're starting to see a pattern. It's not that women weren't creating history. It's that history wasn't written to include them. What about science? You think of Caroline Herschel, who discovered several comets and worked alongside her brother William, only to be thanked vaguely in prefaces. Or Lisa Meitner, who helped uncover nuclear fission, only to be overlooked when her male colleague received the Nobel. And then, the hidden figures. Literally, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, black women at NASA, whose calculations helped send men to the moon. Only decades later did their names break into public knowledge. You flip open a 19th century textbook. It speaks of mankind's progress, man's inventions, and the history of man. Nowhere does it ask who cooked the meals, taught the languages, stitched the wounds, raised the emperors. Historians now work to fill the gaps. They search ship manifests, midwife records, weaving patterns, even marginalia scrawled in prayer books. Clues left behind, often unintentionally. A common thread emerges: domestic knowledge, medical insight, economic labor, all attributed to nobody. Or worse, credited to the community. You stand in the middle of a reconstructed Viking house. For centuries, sagas told tales of axe-wielding men and gods of war. But recently, DNA testing on burial remains revealed something unexpected. Some warriors were women, fully equipped, honored, buried with weapons. Not wives, not daughters, warriors. And what about governance? Ever heard of Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba? A 17th century African queen who outwitted the Portuguese, negotiated peace, led armies and ruled as an equal, if not superior partner in diplomacy. Few textbooks mention her. Or Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor who ruled with force and finesse during the Tang dynasty. Her court historians did their best to trash her legacy. But still, the records survive. You walk through a corridor lined with portraits, some restored, some faded. In each, a woman stares back, not begging for recognition, just waiting. And that's the haunting part. It's not that they weren't there, it's that we stopped looking. You pick up a loose page near the exit. On it is scrawled a phrase, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." You smile at the irony. That quote, widely attributed to Marilyn Monroe or Eleanor Roosevelt, actually came from historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich in an academic article about Puritan funeral sermons. It was never meant as a slogan. It was an observation, a caution. If we only preserve the loudest, the boldest, the most disruptive, we miss the rest. The careful, the kind, the deeply competent. You fold the paper and put it in your pocket. Because forgetting isn't always about malice. Sometimes it's just a failure to pay attention. You're walking now through the southern countryside of France. The sun is warm, the fields are lush, and every hilltop seems to hide a story. But not all stories here end in peace. You're about to enter the world of the Albigensian Crusade, a war not between nations or empires, but between neighbors. A crusade not across continents, but against fellow Christians. It begins in the early 13th century, and it's not about land or gold. It's about heresy. At least that's what the church claimed. The Cathars, also called Albigensians, were a dualist religious group. They believed the material world was evil, created by a false god, and that only the spiritual realm was pure. They rejected the Catholic Church's authority, rituals, and wealth. No churches, no sacraments, no tithes. Just simplicity, pacifism, and a stark alternative view of salvation. You pass through a quiet stone village. It might have once been Cathar, but there are no signs left, no plaques, only ruins and silence. The church didn't like what the Cathars were teaching, nor did the French crown, which saw an opportunity to tighten control over the independently minded South. And so in 1209, Pope Innocent III launched a full-scale crusade against Christians. The first city targeted Béziers. The papal legate leading the siege reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Thousands were slaughtered, men, women, children. Not all were Cathars, but no one was checking. You stop on the edge of a once fortified hilltop town. The stones beneath your feet are sun-bleached now, but once they ran red. Montségur, perhaps, a Cathar stronghold that resisted the Crusaders for years until it fell. Over 200 Cathars were burned alive there, refusing to renounce their faith. Historians still argue whether the Cathars were truly a unified religion or just a loose spiritual movement. Some even suggest the church exaggerated their threat to justify expansion. You enter a chapel. It's quiet, The walls are thick. On one side, a fresco has been scrubbed out. Maybe it once bore a symbol of the heretics. Maybe just a date no one wanted to remember. What's remarkable is how modern some of the Cathar's ideas feel. They believed in gender equality. Women could become spiritual leaders, known as perfects. They abstained from violence, lived modestly, and encouraged questioning authority. That might explain why they were seen as dangerous. Crusaders marched from the North Knights hungry for land and absolution. They were promised the same spiritual reward as those who fought in the Holy Land. But instead of Saracens, they fought farmers, tradesmen, midwives, and poets. You wander into a ruined keep. There's a hole in the center courtyard, maybe an old well. You picture a Cathar family standing there watching the horizon for riders, praying not for victory, but for survival. The Crusade lasted for 20 years, 2 decades of burning, sieging, torturing, and interrogating. When the military campaign ended, the Inquisition began systematic hunting of remaining Cathars, their sympathizers, their texts. Many records were destroyed, others were buried. A few slipped through, like the Book of Two Principles, outlining their cosmology. But most of what we know comes from their enemies. You pick up a crumbling brick. Beneath it, a carved sigil, a circle split by a line. Could be anything, could be nothing. Could be the mark of a people who believed that 2 forces shaped the universe, one of light, one of shadow. Centuries later, legends would grow of Cathar treasure-hidden manuscripts, even the Holy Grail buried beneath Montségur. Probably myths, but the yearning behind them, that's real. A yearning for a history less bloody, for a religion that didn't demand conquest. Modern scholars sometimes refer to the Albigensian Crusade as a template. It was the first time the machinery of holy war was turned inward against a population within Christendom. It set the stage for inquisitions, forced conversions, and religious homogenization across Europe. You stare at the sky above the Pyrenees. Once these mountains hid refugees. Now they hide memories. You imagine a perfect sitting by firelight whispering prayers to a God of pure spirit, knowing they would die tomorrow, but refusing to lie to save themselves. That's not just faith, that's defiance. And the lesson, if there is one, may be this. Sometimes history doesn't forget. Sometimes it chooses to erase. You're standing now on the edge of the Atlantic, salt air in your nose, and volcanic peaks rising behind you. The landscape is wild cliffs of black stone caves in the hills, and winds that whisper old words in forgotten tongues. Welcome to the Canary Islands. Welcome to the last memories of the Guanches. Before the Spanish conquest in the 15th century, these islands weren't uninhabited. They were home to an indigenous people with a strange, silent history. The Guanches didn't leave behind books or scrolls. They left behind mummies, pyramids, and questions. You walk into a cave high on the cliffs of Tenerife. Inside, dry and still, lies a mummified body. Wrapped in layers of leather and plant fiber, the corpse is astonishingly well preserved, better, some argue, than the Egyptian mummies. No resin, no grand tomb, just silence and volcanic dust. Historians still debate where the Guanches came from. The most common theory, they were of Berber origin from North Africa. But how they crossed the sea and when is unclear. Their language contained echoes of ancient Berber dialects, but by the time Europeans arrived, much of it had already faded. You glance at a collection of stone tools, crude by some standards, but functional. The Guanches had no writing system, no metal, and no boats capable of inter-island travel. And yet, each island had a distinct dialect, custom, and political structure. It's like finding 7 separate little civilizations, each developing in isolation for centuries. And then the ships arrived. In the 1400s, Spanish conquerors landed with steel, gunpowder, and diseases. They called the Guanches savages. They enslaved many, converted others by force, and destroyed most of what was left. You walk through an old mission chapel where Guanche rebels were baptized against their will. The records list their new Christian names, but not the ones they'd carried all their lives. Still traces remain. In the museums of Santa Cruz and Las Palmas, you can find their tools, pottery, and even DNA preserved in mummies tucked into rock shelters high above the ocean. Scientists recently analyzed those remains and found links to both Berber and ancient European populations. You turn over a fragment of pottery. Simple designs, geometric, but they repeat as if meaning is embedded in the patterns. Some researchers think the Guanches were developing a proto-symbolic system, something just on the edge of writing. Then there are the pyramids. Yes, pyramids in Guimar, Tenerife. Step structures made of lava rock aligned with the solstices. Some say they're agricultural terraces. Others think they were ceremonial sites. A few fringe theorists, you know the type, link them to ancient Egyptians or even aliens. But here's the honest truth we just don't know. You climb one of the pyramid steps and look out over the Atlantic. No ships today, just sea and sky. There's something about island civilizations. They don't shout their histories, they whisper them. They don't build empires, they build home stones stacked against wind and salt. Historians still argue how much of Guanche culture was destroyed and how much blended into modern Canarian life. Some surnames, food traditions, and agricultural practices carry traces, but the soul of the culture, that may be beyond recovery. You stop beside a ceremonial site, a ring of stones once used for rituals under the stars. The wind whistles through it, now filling the gap where voices used to be. Imagine a people who lived for centuries, carved their lives into the cliffs, honored their dead with care, and faced extinction not from war, but from erasure. Not a fast death, but a slow rewriting. You bend down and touch the volcanic soil. It's warm, rich with memory. And maybe, just maybe, the Guanches aren't fully gone. Maybe they survive not in the history books, but in the blood of the islanders, in the shape of a hillside terrace, or the twist of a word passed from grandmother to child. A memory isn't just what you remember. Sometimes it's what refuses to be forgotten. The desert stretches before you, flat golden shimmering in the heat, like the surface of another planet. But somewhere beneath this sand, beneath layers of forgotten time and wind-blown dust, lies something unexpected, a foreign capital buried under an Egyptian sun. This is the kingdom of Avaris, and it's not supposed to be here. You crouch beside the remains of a crumbled mud brick wall, half excavated. Avaris was once the capital of the Hyksos, a mysterious people who ruled Lower Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, around 1650 to 1550 BCE. But here's the strange part: the Hyksos weren't Egyptian. They came from somewhere else. Historians still debate their origins. Most say they were from the Levant, possibly Canaanites or a mix of Semitic peoples. Others think they were traders, migrants, who slowly gained influence in the Nile Delta until, well, they just sort of took over. You brush sand away from a pottery shard. It's painted in a distinctly non-Egyptian style, more similar to pieces found in ancient Syria than anything from Memphis or Thebes. And then there's the architecture: deep storage pits, fortifications, even horse stables. Horses weren't native to Egypt at this time, and neither were chariots. But the Hyksos, they brought them. You stand at the edge of what was once a royal compound. The layout is strange, part Egyptian, part foreign, a fusion of cultures. And it makes you wonder, was Avaris a symbol of occupation or of cooperation? The traditional Egyptian narrative, as told by later dynasties, is clear: the Hyksos were invaders, barbarians, usurpers. They were eventually driven out by Ahmose the Fern, who reunified Egypt and began the new kingdom. But was it really that black and white? Modern archaeology paints a more complex picture. Avaris wasn't just a military outpost. It was a bustling metropolis full of trade, multicultural rituals, and even intermarriages between Egyptian elites and Hyksos rulers. Temples here worshipped both Egyptian and foreign gods. Artifacts show bilingual inscriptions. You wander into a reconstructed Hyksos temple. It's quiet. The sandstone walls are chipped, but you can still make out carvings of Baal alongside depictions of Egyptian deities. Two pantheons side by side, not battling, but blending. And then there's the theory that makes everyone sit up straighter. Some scholars believe Avaris may be linked to the biblical Exodus. Not the full story as told in scripture, but a historical core. The idea that a Semitic people rose to prominence in Egypt, were later expelled and left behind echoes in religious memory. It's just a theory. But walking through the city's ghostly streets, it doesn't feel impossible. What's fascinating is how little of Avaris survived in public consciousness. For centuries, its location was lost. Only in the 20th century did Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak begin uncovering its remains beneath the modern village of Tel El Daba. You step into a former residence, the floor plan reveals a surprising degree of wealth. Imported luxury items, artistic flourishes, even an inner courtyard for gatherings. These weren't crude raiders, they were urbanites, and they left fingerprints on Egyptian culture that would linger long after their expulsion. Some even argue that Egyptian advancements in warfare fortifications, new weapons, were direct responses to the Hyksos presence. That Egyptian power, ironically, was strengthened because of them. But the records don't say that. The records say they were invaders, pests a plague on the land. Because when you write the history, you get to choose the adjectives. You look out across the desert again. The Nile lies just a few kilometers to the west, winding like a vein through time. Somewhere nearby, the ancient port of Avaris once welcomed ships from the Aegean, the Levant, even Crete. Goods poured in olive oil, bronze tools, lapis lazuli, and with them came ideas. That's the part often overlooked. Avaris was a crossroads, and in history, crossroads are often painted as threats by those who prefer tidy narratives. You run your hand along a sun-warmed brick. It's stamped not with a king's name, but with a merchant's mark. Someone lived here, worked here, laughed here, and then one day they were gone, driven out, or absorbed, or simply moved on. We remember the victors, we quote the monuments. But in places like Avaris, history whispers something softer, that not all conquerors come with swords. Some come with stories, with spices, with horse-drawn carts and lunar calendars. And when they leave, the city breathes once more, collapses and waits for someone like you to find it. The hills of Tuscany are quiet tonight. Olive trees sway under a lazy breeze, and the stars glimmer in their ancient configurations above the patchwork of farms and villages. It's the kind of place where you might expect to hear an old song drift through an open window or catch the scent of bread from a distant kitchen. But tonight we're not here for pasta or poetry. Tonight we're looking for a country that shouldn't exist, and somehow it did. Welcome to the Republic of Cospaia, a tiny sliver of land nestled between two of the most powerful states in Renaissance Italy, the Papal States and the Republic of Florence. You blink and you're standing at a crooked stone marker. On one side it says Florence, on the other Rome. And in between, a little patch of nothing, or everything depending on how you look at it. Cospaia came into existence entirely by accident in 1440. A clerical error. When the Pope sold part of the region to Florence, no one realized there was a strip of land about 3 kilometers long and less than 1 wide that had been left off the treaty maps. The locals noticed, and they did what any bold, slightly mischievous Renaissance villagers might do. They declared themselves independent. Historians still argue whether it was formal independence or just clever resistance. But either way, Cospaia began operating as a sovereign micro-republic with no overlord, no taxes, no official army, and absolutely no bureaucracy. You pass a hand-painted sign, Perpetua et Firma, Libertas Perpetual, and Firm Liberty. Their unofficial motto. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a way of life. You step into a small tavern from the 1600s. Smoke clings to the ceiling beams. A man leans over a barrel rolling tobacco in a square of cloth. That's right, tobacco. Because Cospaia became one of the few places in Europe where tobacco could be grown and traded freely without papal interference or Florence's taxes. In fact, tobacco was so central to Cospaia's identity that locals were known to trade with smugglers and foreign merchants alike. Their fields weren't large, but they were fertile. And because the land was technically free, Cospaia became a haven for rule breakers, refugees, outlaws, and dreamers. You're beginning to get the picture. It wasn't utopia, but it was something we rarely see: a small society that thrived by not being noticed. No army, no jail, no written laws, just oral agreements, community enforcement, and a surprising amount of cooperation. Disputes were settled over wine. Crimes were rare. If you didn't like someone, you walked around their house and muttered under your breath. Simple. Modern scholars scratch their heads at Cospaia. How did it last? How did a patch of anarchy survive for nearly 400 years? Some say its survival was due to being unthreatening. It posed no military danger. It was too small to matter. Others argue it played Florence and the Vatican against each other, subtly reminding each side that, hey, if you try to take us, the other side might get mad. And then there's the third theory: Cospaia worked because it never wanted to be more than it was. You visit the village church, not a cathedral, just a modest chapel. The priest also brews beer. The local council, just a handful of elders who gathered at the tavern and argued until consensus appeared. They printed no currency, issued no passports, collected no tax, and yet for centuries they endured. Eventually the dream had to end. In 1826, after decades of political pressure and border tightening across Italy, Cospaia was quietly absorbed. Its independence was formally dissolved. Some say the villagers were paid off with a modest pension. Others claim they simply sighed, lit another pipe, and went back to their fields. Today, Cospaia is barely a dot on the map. A village of a few hundred, most of whom have no idea they live on what was once a sovereign state. But if you listen closely in the village square, where old men still play cards under the fig trees, you'll hear the stories about how their ancestors tricked two powers into leaving them alone, about how liberty isn't always loud, it can be stubborn, quiet, and sunburnt, about how sometimes freedom lives in the places no one bothers to look. You pause by a worn stone wall with initials carved into it. One reads, RC, could be Repubblica di Cospaia, or maybe just someone's name. Either way, you smile, because somewhere in this sleepy valley, a little spark of rebellion is still flickering. A reminder that history isn't just made by kings, empires, and armies. Sometimes it's made by a village with no borders, no masters, and just enough tobacco to keep the dream alive. It's dark now, and the room you're standing in looks like something out of a mystery novel. A museum display case softly lit its glass, just slightly fogged from the humidity of curious breath. Inside it rests a perfect geometric enigma, a small bronze object about the size of a grapefruit with 12 flat faces and circular holes punched into each one. No label explains it. No ancient manual tells you what to do with it. You've just met the Roman Dodecahedron. Dozens of these strange objects have been found scattered across Europe from Britain to Hungary, but no written record from the Roman Empire ever mentions them. Not one. You tilt your head and peer through one of the holes. The inside is hollow. Some of the dodecahedrons are simple. Others are decorated with tiny knobs at each corner. A few are cast from leaded bronze. Others, fine brass. Historians still argue what they were used for. Were they tools, toys, ritual objects, surveying instruments? Every theory seems almost plausible and maddeningly incomplete. You imagine a Roman engineer somewhere in Gaul fiddling with one of these at their workbench. Did it help them measure distance? Some have theorized that the dodecahedron could be used to estimate projectile sizes for artillery, each hole representing a different caliber. But there's a problem. There's no standard size across the specimens. No two are identical. Some are small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. Others require both hands to hold. Another theory suggests they were used by Roman woolworkers, maybe as knitting aids to size gloves or fabrics. But again, no documentation, just educated guessing. You pick up a replica surprisingly lightweight. You turn it slowly in your hand. The symmetry is mesmerizing. You can't help but notice how the holes line up in ways that could let light through, almost like some kind of optical tool. That's led to another idea: astrological use. Some believe the dodecahedron could help determine the optimal planting times or calculate the positions of stars. But that theory leans into speculation. The Romans had highly developed calendars already. Would they need this? Then, there's the more mystical proposal that these objects were ritual tools used by a priestly class. Maybe the holes were for candles, or maybe they held sacred herbs. Perhaps they were used in divination. You're beginning to realize the real power of the dodecahedron isn't just in what it might have done, it's in what it makes you wonder. Because even in a civilization as well documented as Rome, some things slipped through the cracks, lost in translation, forgotten in time. You pass into another wing of the museum. A display map marks the locations where dodecahedrons have been found, mostly near the borders of the Roman Empire, in what were once frontier provinces. That's odd, isn't it? Why don't we find them in Rome itself, or in Athens? Why mostly in places like Belgium, Germany, and France? Some believe this was a tool meant for specific outposts, perhaps related to local customs, or even a hybrid invention developed at the fringes of empire. Maybe the Romans didn't create the dodecahedron at all. Maybe they just used them after encountering them abroad. One dig site in Austria yielded a dodecahedron buried alongside Roman coins and tools, but also with Celtic trinkets. Cultural fusion, or coincidence. You crouch beside a 3D print model being used by a curious student group. One of them is using the holes to cast shadows from a flashlight across a board. The shadows form crisp, concentric rings. It's beautiful, useless, profound. And maybe that's the point. Not everything in ancient life had a singular function. Some things existed because they were intriguing, because they sparked curiosity, like a fidget toy made for philosophers, or a puzzle gifted to someone who already had everything else. Modern experimental archaeologists have made working replicas and tried to test various functions. Some do, in fact, allow for crude range finding when held at arm's length. Others can focus light through water droplets in fascinating ways. But even with all our simulations, we can't say definitively what they were for. And that quietly is what makes the Roman dodecahedron so powerful. It forces us to admit we don't know. We can explain so much about Roman architecture, aqueducts, gladiator games, and road systems, but a simple, hollow bronze object that stops us in our tracks. You walk back toward the exit. One last dodecahedron is mounted alone on a pedestal. A spotlight highlights its gentle shine. Its 12 faces shimmer softly in the low light. It looks modern, like something you'd find on a designer's desk, a desktop ornament, a conversation piece. You reach out a hand but don't touch, because whatever it once was, it deserves a little mystery. And in that moment, you understand. Not all lost history lies buried in sand. Some of it sits in plain sight, staring you in the face, saying nothing at all. It's early morning, and you're leaning over a massive parchment laid flat under glass. The edges are worn. The colors have faded with time. But your eyes are drawn to something deeply strange, an outline of South America. Or what looks like South America, only it's 1513, and no one is supposed to know that shape yet. You're staring at the Piri Reis map, one of the most mysterious and controversial nautical charts in the world. Made by Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, the map is just a fragment of a larger world map. But even in its partial state, it challenges conventional timelines. It shows parts of the New World accurately. Too accurately, some would argue. The parchment itself is made of gazelle skin, its lines drawn with remarkable precision. You lean closer. The text is in Ottoman Turkish, and Piri Reis writes that he compiled it from many earlier sources, some from sailors, some from Greek maps, and some far older. This is where things get strange. One section appears to show the coastline of Antarctica. Not the frozen ice-covered mass we know today, but a version without ice. A landmass that would have required aerial surveying, or at least an ice-free view not seen for thousands of years. Historians still argue whether it's truly Antarctica or just a distorted depiction of South America. But even if it's just the Americas, the accuracy is astonishing for its time. The Amazon River is in the right spot. The Andes curve like they should. Piri Reis himself claims he used a map drawn by Christopher Columbus, one now lost. But where did Columbus get his information? The rabbit hole deepens. You move along the coastline drawn in ink, detailed harbors, annotations about local tribes, ocean currents, and sea monsters. Sea monsters. There's one coiled near the coast of Africa, all teeth and fins. You chuckle quietly. Were those embellishments or genuine reports? Either way, they reveal something about the mindset of the age, where fact and myth were not separate islands, but part of the same ocean. There's a debate among scholars: was the map purely based on European and Islamic sources, or did it somehow incorporate knowledge from lost civilizations? Some fringe theorists go wild here. They claim it's proof of ancient advanced mapping technologies, or survivors of Atlantis, or aliens who dropped by with Google Earth blueprints. But that's more bedtime fantasy than history. What we do know is this: Piri Reis was a master of his craft. He served under the Ottoman Navy, fought in Mediterranean campaigns, and was one of the most knowledgeable seafarers of his time. He understood navigation geography and cartographic detail. But even so, the map contains information far ahead of what mainstream Europe claimed to know. How? One plausible answer: older source maps from before the Library of Alexandria burned. From civilizations like the Greeks, Phoenicians, or even earlier maritime cultures that never wrote their achievements down. You step into a mock-up of Piri Reis's study. There are ink bottles, compass roses etched on the table, half-burned candles, a globe with wide ocean gaps. You imagine him hunched over the skin parchment, stitching together scraps from half a dozen sources, trying to make sense of a world bigger than anyone realized. The irony: much of the Ottoman Empire didn't appreciate the value of his work, and neither did Europe. After his execution, yes, Piri Reis was beheaded in 1553 for alleged insubordination. His map was forgotten for centuries. It wasn't rediscovered until 1929 in the library of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. That means for hundreds of years this astonishing artifact sat in silence, unseen, uncelebrated, just waiting, and when it was finally studied, it turned heads across the globe. You trace the ink along the west coast of Africa. The curves are elegant, the proportions nearly perfect. How did he get it so right? Was it luck, collective wisdom from older maps, or something else? Modern technology, satellite comparisons, and overlays have only deepened the mystery. Some areas align with startling precision. Others contain distortions that suggest perspective, as if the cartographer was working from an aerial viewpoint, not a sailor's. And then there's the Orontius Phineas map, drawn just decades later, which also seems to show an ice-free Antarctic coast. Coincidence or shared source? You take a breath. It's easy to spiral here, but grounding yourself in what's provable helps. The Piri Reis map isn't magic. It's not a time machine, but it is a whisper from a world where knowledge flowed in hidden channels, where empires rose, fell, and forgot more than they remembered. And sometimes when a parchment survives the fire, it can teach us something long after the ink has dried. You walk away from the glass. Behind you, the map remains curled ever so slightly at the corner, like it wants to keep revealing more. But for now, it says only this: the world is larger, older, and stranger than you've been told. The afternoon light slants through narrow museum windows, catching on glass cases and turning metal to gold. You find yourself drawn to one display in particular, not because it's flashy, but because it's impossible. Inside the case sits a smooth oval stone. It's black, polished, and engraved with what looks like a scene from a prehistoric comic book. This is one of the Ica stones, part of a bizarre and controversial collection, discovered or perhaps fabricated in Peru. You stare at the carving on this particular stone. A man, unmistakably human, appears to be riding a dinosaur. A dinosaur. Another stone shows a complex surgery, a brain transplant by the looks of it. Another, a celestial map. Telescopes. Heart surgery. All this, carved into rocks supposedly thousands of years old. Historians still argue whether the Ica stones are ancient artifacts or modern forgeries. And honestly, as you look around the exhibit, you're torn. The story begins in the 1960s when a local farmer named Basilio Uchuya began selling these carved stones to tourists. Hundreds, then thousands, began to emerge, some from dry riverbeds, others found in caves. Eventually, the collection ballooned to over 15,000 individual stones. Enter Dr. Javier Cabrera, a Peruvian physician who became obsessed with them. He built a private museum and proposed a radical theory. The stones were the remnants of a long-lost, highly advanced pre-Incan civilization, one that coexisted with dinosaurs, one that understood brain surgery, one that mapped the stars with a sophistication we still struggle to match. You try not to roll your eyes, but part of you wants to believe it. Cabrera argued that the Ica civilization left behind this legacy as a warning, that they destroyed themselves with technology, that the stones were their black box messages to the future written in stone. But then the backlash. Uchuya, under pressure from Peruvian authorities, admitted he'd faked many of the stones, said he used dental tools and a lighter. Then, in another interview, he claimed he only said that to avoid jail for selling antiquities. In short, contradiction layered on contradiction. You examine the surface of a nearby stone under magnification. There's no patina in the carved grooves suggesting they're modern, but others do show signs of age. How do you tell what's real when the forgers are better historians than the archaeologists? The museum is quiet, just the hum of air conditioning and the faint echo of your own steps. There's something eerie about the sheer number of these stones. If they're hoaxes, it's one of the largest, most sustained archaeological forgeries in modern history. And if they're not, well then, the world is a very different place than we thought. You glance at one of the more disturbing pieces. It shows what looks like genetic manipulation, two figures working over a third, with something like DNA strands in the background. It's crude, cartoonish even, but oddly specific. Could someone in the 1960s really have made all this up? Possibly. But why so many, and why such consistency in artistic style? Historians still debate whether the stones reflect a mishmash of local folklore, science fiction, and modern conspiracy theories, or if they're fragments of something deeper. Perhaps they're not ancient at all, but rather a modern mythology carved in stone, a reflection of our fears, dreams, and wildest guesses. Some fringe theorists, of course, connect them to Atlantis, Lemuria, even aliens. But if you peel back those claims, what remains is something more human. A desire to leave a mark, to say we were here, whether by truth or tale. You sit down on a bench across from the display. One stone shows a couple under the star's arms, raised toward a celestial object. It's simple, poetic, almost tender. You start to wonder if some of the stones, fake or not, are less about science and more about longing. Maybe someone in a quiet village just wanted to imagine a different history, one where the past was as strange and vivid as our most colorful myths. Because really, who doesn't want to believe that the Andes once echoed with the steps of dinosaurs and philosophers? You stand to leave but glance back once more. The Ica stones may never be fully proven or disproven. They sit in that liminal space between fact and fiction, between dream and documentation. And that may be where they belong, Because the true mystery isn't whether they're real. It's why we want them to be. It's evening now. The museum has mostly emptied. Your footsteps echo softly down a side corridor until you stop in front of something that doesn't quite look like it belongs among polished displays and catalogued artifacts. It's wrapped in linen, yellowed with age, crisscrossed with faint bloodstains, and covered with the faint image of a man's body. You're looking at the Shroud of Turin. There are few artifacts more debated, more studied, or more emotionally charged than this piece of ancient linen. For centuries, it has been venerated as the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. And for just as long, it has been questioned, scanned, radiocarbon dated, and even accused of being a medieval hoax. You move closer. The image is faint, almost like a photographic negative, until you blink, and suddenly the face is there. Eyes closed, beard, wounds on the wrists and feet, a body laid flat, arms crossed. How did this image get here? That question has baffled scientists, believers, and skeptics alike. Historians still argue whether the shroud is the genuine burial cloth of Christ or a later creation. Radiocarbon dating tests conducted in 1988 suggested the cloth dated to the 13th or 14th century, medieval, not ancient. But even that testing was controversial. Critics argue that the tested samples came from a repaired edge of the cloth, not the original linen. You shift your gaze from the body image to the faint burn marks and water stains that streak the fabric. These imperfections came from a fire in 1532, when the shroud was nearly destroyed in a chapel blaze in Chambéry, France. Its survival, like its origin, feels improbable. And then there's the image itself. Modern imaging techniques, including ultraviolet fluorescence and 3D mapping, have revealed that the image isn't painted or dyed. There are no brush strokes, no pigment, just a change in the outermost fibers of the linen, a scorching or oxidization no deeper than a few microns. No known artist from any era, ancient or medieval, had the tools or knowledge to produce such an effect. You crouch to examine the copy on display. Most museums show a replica because the real shroud, preserved in a temperature-controlled vault in Turin, Italy, is shown only rarely. Still, replicas capture the eerie clarity of the face, that expressionless calm. The proportions, the bloodstains, the crown of thorns, it's all there. Some theories suggest the image was created by a natural chemical reaction, a kind of microbial browning. Others argue for more dramatic explanations, spontaneous radiation, or even a moment of divine energy release. And then there are those who shrug and say, it's a medieval art piece, get over it. But if it is, it's a singular one. No other known artifact looks like this. No other relic has ignited centuries of fascination, religious devotion, and scientific scrutiny in quite the same way. You reach for the printed timeline beneath the display. It traces the shroud's known history. It first appeared publicly in the 1350s in Lille, France. A local knight, Geoffroy de Charny, claimed it was the authentic burial cloth of Christ. But church officials were skeptical even then. A bishop denounced it as a forgery. Yet it continued to inspire pilgrims, to draw crowds, to survive wars, fires, revolutions. Even now, in the age of atomic clocks and Mars rovers, people still line up to glimpse it. Because belief doesn't die easily, especially when it's sewn into the folds of cloth. You sit on the nearby bench and imagine what the world must have felt like when the shroud first emerged. Europe was reeling from the Black Death. Religious uncertainty ran high. People needed signs, miracles, something to hold on to in a crumbling world. The shroud offered all of that. But was it real? You try to think objectively. Many experts believe the 14th century was a time of sophisticated religious forgeries intended not to deceive, but to inspire faith. Holy relics were traded like currency. Bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, pieces of the Virgin's veil. Could the shroud have been one of those? Possibly. And yet, there's that image. Impossible, unexplained, elegant in its simplicity. If it's fake, it's the greatest forgery in human history. If it's real, it might be the most sacred object ever discovered. You're beginning to see that the power of the Shroud lies not in whether it's authentic. Its power lies in what it means. To the devout, it is a holy relic proof of the resurrection, a physical bridge between heaven and earth. To skeptics, it is a brilliant artifact, one that invites deeper questioning and re-evaluation of how much we actually know. And to everyone else, it's a mystery draped in cloth, one that refuses to be folded neatly away. You stand and walk slowly toward the exit. The light catches the linen one last time, the faint face watching you as you go. In a world of fast answers and constant noise, the Shroud remains silent. But that silence, it speaks volumes. The room you enter now is cooler, intentionally kept that way. Soft lights beam down on a row of small stone spheres, each one perched like a sacred object on a cushioned pedestal. They don't look particularly impressive at first. They're about the size of a baseball, smooth, dark, almost metallic in appearance. But there's something odd about them, like they were made on purpose. You're looking at the Klerksdorp sphere's geological anomalies found in South Africa, and the subject of ongoing scientific debate, whispered theories, and the occasional outlandish speculation. These stone-like objects were discovered in 3-billion-year-old pyrophyllite deposits near the town of Ottosdal. That's 3 billion with a B, a time when multicellular life hadn't even made its debut on Earth. And yet, here they are, perfectly round spheres, some with equatorial grooves encircling them as though they were lathed or machined. That's what first raised eyebrows. You lean closer to one under glass. The groove is shallow, subtle, and yet symmetrical all the way around. It's the kind of thing you'd expect from a tool-assisted process, not random mineralization. Historians still argue whether these spheres are just unusual geologic formations or evidence of something more unsettling. Geologists classify them as concretions, natural formations caused by mineral precipitation around a core. Essentially, a stone snowball that grows in layers. That explains the roundness. But what about the grooves? Some scientists say the grooves could result from fibrous crystal structures collapsing in specific ways. Others admit they're puzzled, especially because some of the grooves are so precise they suggest tooling. No one has fully replicated them under natural conditions in a lab. Then there's the wild side. Fringe theorists propose that these spheres are parts out-of-place artifacts. In other words, evidence that intelligent life existed on Earth long before humans, or that someone or something visited us in the distant past. You know, aliens. It's tempting to laugh. But the mystery remains. One of the spheres on display has an almost metallic sheen. Tests have shown they're composed of hematite or wollastonite hard minerals that wouldn't break down easily. Some even have magnetic properties, causing compass needles to behave strangely when placed nearby. You watch a short looped video playing on the screen behind the case. It shows miners discovering the spheres in deep rock layers, sometimes embedded perfectly in solid stone. Not in a cavern or loose sediment. Inside the rock. That detail alone makes your skin crawl a little. Of course, there's always the human mind's tendency to find patterns in randomness. It's called pareidolia. Maybe the grooves aren't so perfect. Maybe the symmetry is exaggerated. Maybe these are just curious rocks and nothing more. But your gut says otherwise. You picture an ancient world before trees, before fish, before anything. Just lava oceans and storms. And then imagine someone dropping a stone sphere into the mud. Just one. As a marker. A hint. It sounds like a sci-fi novella, sure. But it also sounds like something you'd want to believe. You pace slowly through the rest of the exhibit. Some of the spheres have cracked open, revealing concentric rings within, like the inside of a pearl, only made of mineral layers hardened over epochs. They're beautiful in a way that doesn't require explanation. And maybe that's the point. Science hasn't fully dismissed them. The spheres defy easy classification, and for now, they remain a footnote in geology textbooks and a sidebar in mystery blogs. Their original discovery site has been mostly mined out, so new specimens are rare, which adds to their legend. You stop at a quote etched on the display plaque. It reads, "We do not need aliens to explain every mystery, but we do need curiosity to question what we think we know." It's well put. Because the Klerksdorp spheres don't have to be alien artifacts to be fascinating. Their mere existence reminds us that Earth's past is so vast, so ancient, and so dynamic that strange things are bound to emerge. Some will be explained, some will be faked, and some, just a few, will sit quietly in a display case and challenge everything. You walk away with one last glance over your shoulder. One of the spheres almost seems to wink in the light. But maybe that's just your imagination. You turn a corner and find yourself in front of a long glass case with soft illumination falling over what looks at first glance like a Viking sword. But as you step closer, you realize there's something off. The metal is too smooth, too clean, too advanced for the era it supposedly comes from. This is no ordinary weapon. This is an Ulfberht sword, and it shouldn't exist. Etched along its blade in bold, almost mystical letters is a single word, Ulfberht. Sometimes it's spelled with a cross at the beginning, an end, sometimes not. And sometimes the spelling is just slightly wrong. But every version points to one mystery, a medieval European sword made with metal that seems centuries ahead of its time. Historians still argue whether the Ulfberht swords were made by a specific family, a religious order, or even forged under some long-forgotten contract between Vikings and Eastern metallurgists. What we know for sure is this: beginning around the 9th century, Ulfberht swords started appearing in graves, battlefields, and treasure hoards all over Europe from Norway to Hungary. Over 170 have been found so far. The remarkable thing isn't just their craftsmanship, it's their composition. The average European sword of the time was brittle, uneven, prone to snapping. That's because medieval smelters couldn't remove enough impurities from iron ore. But Ulfberht, it's made from crucible steel with a carbon content up to 3 times higher than anything Europe was supposed to be able to produce at the time. That level of metallurgy wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. So where did it come from? Some believe the secret came from the East. Crucible steel, also called Wootz, was being made in India and Persia as early as 300 BCE. Traders moving along the Silk Road may have carried this knowledge, or even the steel itself, into Northern Europe. That would mean Ulfberht wasn't a person at all, but a brand. A symbol stamped on the best steel blades money could buy. The medieval equivalent of "made in Damascus." You stare at the etching again. Some blades have Ulfberht plus spelled precisely the letters sharp and even. Others have crooked or misspelled versions, Ulfberht or Ulfberht, without the final cross. That led scholars to another discovery: counterfeits. Even in the 10th century, someone was trying to rip off luxury goods. Lesser blacksmiths forged the Ulfberht name onto inferior swords, hoping to pass them off as the real deal. The true Ulfberhts had steel so pure it could only have been smelted under extreme heat up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a feat that European furnaces weren't capable of at the time. The fakes' sloppy welds, crude iron, they broke in battle. You wonder who carried the originals: Viking warlords, Crusader knights, wealthy kings trying to show off their connections to the East. You imagine one of those real blades in your hand, gleaming in a winter sunlight, and deadly, a perfect blend of art and war. And then you wonder how many smiths died with the secret of its creation, because after the 11th century, the Ulfberht name disappears. Poof, gone, like the steel itself. Some historians suggest that as trade routes changed and the knowledge pipeline dried up, the steel supply dwindled. Maybe the forgers simply gave up. Or maybe they were absorbed into new empires, their skills lost amid conquest and shifting borders. There's a theory that the Ulfberht name comes from a Frankish monastery, that the swords were blessed, perhaps even sanctified, before being sold, which opens an even weirder possibility The monks were smuggling high-grade weapons across Europe, the holiest arms dealers in history. You step aside to watch a documentary clip playing on a nearby monitor. A modern blacksmith attempts to replicate an Ulfberht sword using only medieval tools and ingredients. It takes weeks. The heat has to be sustained with bellows and charcoal. The impurities must be beaten out with terrifying precision. In the end, the sword he makes, while beautiful, still doesn't quite match the quality of the original Ulfberht. You think of the warriors who wielded them, the enemies who realized too late that their own weapons were no match. You imagine a Viking jarl watching his enemies break their blades on his perfect steel, smiling grimly before charging. But beyond the battles, beyond the politics and blood, is the mystery of how. How did someone in early medieval Europe, whether by genius accident or foreign alliance, forge something so advanced, so pure, that it outshone the next 800 years of technology? And why, once they had that gift, did it vanish? The Ulfberht isn't just a sword. It's a warning, a whisper from history that says, even when we're capable of greatness, we don't always hold on to it. You glance back at the blade as you leave. The steel catches the light, and for a moment, it seems to glow. Not with fire, but with loss. It feels like stepping into the cosmos. You've just entered a small circular room with dark walls and a glowing centerpiece. Floating beneath the glass is a bronze disc, weathered, but still dazzling like a slice of the night sky hammered into metal. Constellations, curved bands of gold, a smattering of dots that might be stars or something older. This is the Nebra sky disk, and it may be the oldest known representation of the cosmos in human history. Discovered in 1999 by metal detectorists in the forests of Saxony-Anhalt, Germany, the disk instantly captured global fascination. It measures just over a foot across, made of bronze with gold inlays representing celestial symbols. Historians still argue whether the Nebra disk was simply a religious artifact, a ritual tool, or an early astronomical calendar. You lean in. The first thing you notice is the golden circle, probably the sun, or the full moon. There's also a crescent moon, and a cluster of 7 dots that most agree represent the Pleiades, the 7 sisters. That alone suggests a skywatcher's knowledge. The Pleiades have long served as seasonal markers for planting and harvesting across many ancient cultures. But what really gets you is the precision. This isn't random decoration, it's cosmology. Real observable alignments embedded in bronze. The curved gold arcs along the edges seem to mark the solstices, the range of the sun's rising and setting over the year at that specific latitude. That's right. This 3,600-year-old disk, a product of the European Bronze Age, shows an understanding of solar motion. Before writing, before the wheel reached some parts of the continent. Who were these people? We call them part of the Ionetis culture, a network of early Bronze Age tribes in Central Europe. Not exactly textbook astronomers. And yet, here is the sky mapped out by hand. Archaeologists believe the disk was originally buried alongside 2 swords, 2 axe heads, a chisel, and spiral bracelets. Not treasure necessarily, but something closer to a ceremonial cache. A gift to the gods. A burial. A political statement. The disk went underground literally and figuratively for centuries. In fact, it wasn't even discovered legally. The 2 men who unearthed it were looters. They damaged it while prying it from the earth, then tried to sell it on the black market. Only later was it recovered by German authorities in a sting operation involving undercover agents and a hotel sting in Basel, Switzerland. You couldn't make this up if you tried. You watch a simulation on a screen nearby. It shows how the disk could have helped early Europeans track the seasons, marking the days when planting would yield the best harvest, or when to prepare for winter. It might have been the farmer's almanac of its day, except forged in bronze and gold, not printed on paper. There's something elegant about that. Some scholars even argue that the disk reflects a merging of sky-based and solar-based timekeeping systems, a rare thing for the era. Most early cultures stuck to one or the other. Whoever made the Nebra sky disk understood both. And then, just as suddenly as it appears in the historical record, it disappears. The people who used it likely had no written language, no books or scrolls to pass down their knowledge. Instead, they left behind artifacts like this dense cryptic and breathtaking, but without context. That's part of what makes the Nebra sky disk so mysterious. We don't know what they called it. We don't know who held it. We don't even know what they believed about the heavens. Just this, they looked up and wanted to understand. You step back and imagine the night sky of Bronze Age Europe. No cities, no light pollution, just a canopy of stars that must have felt closer, more alive. If you were a tribal chieftain or shaman, wouldn't you want to capture that preserve the rhythm of the heavens in something you could hold? Of course you would. But here's the twist. Recent research suggests that the disk may have been altered over time. The gold arcs, the solstice markers, may have been added later after the original disk was already centuries old. That means it wasn't just an artifact. It was an evolving object updated and reinterpreted by successive generations. A living calendar, perhaps even a symbol of sacred authority. You imagine a leader holding it up to the horizon, pointing to the rising sun, declaring when the seasons would change. Not superstition, science in its infancy. The disk, for all its mystery, is a bridge, a snapshot of the moment when humanity started to turn observation into explanation. When the sky went from being a mystery to being a tool. And in that sense, it's us. It's the beginning of the very mindset that built the telescopes, the satellites, the observatories. It's where wonder met reason. You take one last look at the Nebra sky disk as the exhibit's lights dim to simulate nightfall. The gold gleams like starlight. It isn't just an artifact. It's a memory of when the sky first began to tell us stories and we finally started listening. You step into what feels like the deepest chamber of this museum, quiet, hushed, and infused with something that almost feels like reverence. On a pedestal ahead of you lies an enormous book. No, not just a book. Atome. Nearly 3 feet tall, over 160 pounds, and bound in leather the color of dried blood. Its pages, vellum, not paper, gleam faintly under the spotlight. And somewhere buried within those pages is a legend that refuses to die. You're standing before the Codex Gigas, more famously known as the Devil's Bible. The name isn't a marketing gimmick. Flip to the center of this book, and you'll find a chilling full-page illustration of the devil-horned crowned and grinning in an oddly cartoonish way. The kind of drawing that makes you chuckle first and shiver later. But it's not just the illustration that makes this manuscript one of the strangest objects ever created. It's everything else about it. The Codex Gigas was created in the early 13th century in the Benedictine monastery of Podlajic in what is now the Czech Republic. The entire thing, both Old and New Testaments, plus histories, medical texts, spells, calendars, and even a necrology, was written by a single hand. Historians still argue whether it's physically possible for one monk to have done this. Because here's the thing, the handwriting doesn't change. Not in the spacing, not in the ink, not in the style. It's eerily consistent for over 300 pages. Experts estimate it would have taken about 25 to 30 years of uninterrupted work to complete. But the codex doesn't show the usual signs of aging across decades of scribal work. No visible shift in the scribe's grip ink tone or fatigue-induced error. It's as if the whole thing was written in a fevered burst. Which brings us to the legend. According to one medieval story, the codex was the work of a monk condemned to death for breaking his vows. In a desperate plea for mercy, he promised to write a book that would contain all human knowledge in a single night. The abbot agreed on the condition that the book be finished by dawn. The monk tried, he failed, but instead of giving up, he made a deal. At midnight, he called upon Lucifer and sold his soul in exchange for the devil's help. The rest, as they say, was scribbled history. And just to say thank you, the monk added that full-page portrait of his infernal patron. Is it true? Probably not. But as you stare into that grinning face, you can't quite be sure. The manuscript itself is a marvel of organization. It contains not just sacred texts, but practical guides for everything from exorcisms to diagnosing fevers. There's even a list of dead monks from the monastery, kind of like a holy yearbook. You flip through a digital copy on a nearby screen. The illustrations are minimal, except for the few full-page ones, like the Devil and the Heavenly City. The rest is rows upon rows of text laid out with painstaking precision, and the margins weirdly clean. No medieval doodles, no hasty corrections. Just perfection over and over. Some pages bear mysterious damage. In 1594, the codex was taken by Swedish forces as war booty and moved to Stockholm, where it resides today. Along the way, it survived fires, theft attempts, and even a fall from a window. Still, it remains remarkably intact. Scholars debate whether the book's true purpose was spiritual encyclopedic or political. Maybe it was meant as a display of the monastery's power. Maybe it was a labor of devotion. Or maybe it was meant to do what it still does: awe. There's something haunting about it. Something off, like the scribe had too much time or none at all. And what about that devil illustration? It's oddly playful. Red tongue, furry arms, clawed feet, and yet it occupies the dead center of the book, as though everything in the codex flows toward and away from that image. It's not just decoration, it's a statement. You wonder what the monk was thinking when he drew it. Was it a confession, a warning, or something else entirely? There's no denying the craftsmanship. The Codex Gigas remains one of the largest medieval manuscripts ever made, and possibly the most mysterious. Every few years, new analyses reveal something strange, inks not matching any local recipe, or faint outlines of removed text beneath existing passages. Erasure, editing, secrets. Maybe the Codex wasn't just a book of knowledge. Maybe it was a vault. You lean closer. For a moment, the silence is overwhelming. The kind of hush that fills only the oldest places. The weight of time, of parchment and prayers and possible damnation. Then you step back. The devil's grin seems to follow you. And maybe that's the whole point. The lighting here is dimmer, as if the museum itself is whispering that the next exhibit should be approached with caution, maybe even skepticism. Behind the glass lies a book, or rather, something that looks like a book. Its cover is unassuming brown, time-worn, simple. But crack it open and you're face to face with the most unreadable manuscript ever discovered, the Rohank Codex. You'd think it was a joke if it weren't so carefully done. Nearly 450 pages of elegantly handwritten text, complete with mysterious symbols and illustrations, none of which align with any known language, culture, or religious system. And yet, someone at some point in time went to great lengths to write it. Historians still argue whether the Rohank Codex is a brilliant hoax or an authentic relic of a forgotten civilization. First surfacing in the 19th century in Hungary, the Codex was donated to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences by a nobleman named Gustav Batthyány. Since then, it's baffled linguists, cryptographers, and amateur sleuths alike. The text is written in a unique script that includes over 800 different characters, far more than most languages need. You stare at the open page. The script flows from right to left, and the letters vary wildly in form and frequency. It doesn't look random, it looks intentional. And then there are the illustrations. They depict religious scenes, baptisms, processions, crucifixions, but with figures dressed in what appear to be non-Christian robes. Some scenes resemble early Christian iconography, others seem more Eastern, almost Islamic or Hindu. But nothing matches perfectly. The Codex lives in a kind of in-between place, part sacred, part strange. Several scholars have tried to decode the manuscript over the years, but every theory runs into the same problem: too much variance, not enough consistency. One theory posits that the Rohank Codex is a cipher, a code that hides a real language underneath. If that's true, it's one of the most sophisticated ciphers ever created. No frequency analysis, No repetition, no pattern has held long enough to unlock it. Another theory suggests it's an elaborate constructed language like Tolkien's Elvish or Klingon, but from the 1500s or earlier. That would make it the work of a single genius laboring in isolation to create a world in a book. Then there's the hoax theory. Maybe someone in the 18th or 19th century wanted to make fools of scholars by crafting a fake language just convincing enough to attract attention. If so, they succeeded, because 200 years later, we're still talking about it. But that theory falls apart the more time you spend with the codex. The pages show signs of genuine age. The ink, the parchment, even the binding style all point to a manuscript at least several hundred years old. And the illustrations, while odd, are consistent, drawn with care, following an internal visual logic that suggests this wasn't a parody or prank. You flip through a digitized version on a nearby screen. On one page, soldiers march with spears. On another, a man baptizes a child in a river. There's even a scene that looks like a coronation, complete with crown altar and a ring of kneeling figures. The codex doesn't just tell a story, it tells a culture. But whose? No nation claims it. No folklore mentions it. No descendant language or script has emerged from it. Some linguists point out that the codex's characters vaguely resemble Brahmi script from ancient India. Others see traces of medieval Hungarian shorthand. A few even claim it's Romani or Shikler script, but the grammar never adds up. And there's this: the codex was never translated. Not even partially, not convincingly anyway. In a world where we've cracked Linear B and found the Rosetta Stone, the Rohank Codex stands defiant. It shrugs at our algorithms and machine learning models. It mocks frequency analysis and cryptographic tricks. It just is. You imagine the person who wrote it hunched over a desk candle flickering drawing symbols that only they understood. Did they think someone would eventually decode it? Or was it always meant to be a private scripture, a holy work for eyes that no longer exist? Maybe they weren't alone. Maybe there was a whole monastery of Rohank scribes. Or maybe it was just one deeply devoted eccentric with an astonishing imagination. You start to realize the power of this artifact doesn't lie in its answers, it lies in its questions. What if this book records a religion lost to time? What if it tells the history of a people we've forgotten, or a world that never quite existed? It's a literary ghost, a whisper from a culture whose name we'll never know. You glance back at the real codex under glass. Its pages lie still quiet, like they're waiting. But for what? A reader smart enough to decode them. A moment in history when its purpose will make sense. Or maybe it's waiting for you. You lean closer, but still it says nothing. And that silence, it's loud. The next display is a disc simple in shape, but heavy with the kind of mystery that glues you in place. It's made of baked clay and only about 6 inches across, yet it may be the most controversial object ever unearthed from the Bronze Age. This is the Phaistos disc, an enigma pulled from the ruins of ancient Crete, and one that's been spinning scholarly heads since the day it was discovered. It was found in 1908 by Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier, buried in the basement of a Minoan palace at Phaistos. Even back then, it was already a riddle. The disc features a series of stamped symbols spiraling out from the center on both sides. Unlike anything else from its time, these symbols weren't carved, they were pressed into the clay using stamps. Yes, actual typefaces. Letters or icons pressed into wet clay centuries before movable type was supposed to exist. Historians still argue whether the Phaistos disc represents a form of writing a proto-language or a ceremonial artifact with no linguistic purpose at all. You tilt your head trying to decode the spirals. There are 241 distinct impressions arranged in a continuous swirl, made up of 45 unique symbols, everything from human figures to fish feathers, arrows, and what looks suspiciously like a modern-day tulip. No other object from the Minoan civilization or anywhere else features this system of writing. It's a standalone puzzle, a one-off piece that offers no context, no translation key, and no sibling artifacts to compare it with. That's part of what makes it so maddening. Some archaeologists believe it's a form of Linear A, the Minoan script we still haven't cracked. Others suggest it might represent a syllabary like Linear B, which was later deciphered and linked to early Greek. But the symbols on the Phaistos disk don't match any known system, ancient or modern. There's a theory that the disk wasn't even made on Crete. Its spiral layout is more reminiscent of Mesopotamian texts or even ancient Chinese formats, which has led some to speculate that the artifact may have originated elsewhere and found its way to Crete via trade or conquest. Or here's the strange bit, it may have been created by a lone artisan experimenting with a new idea. A Bronze Age inventor trying to revolutionize communication, who never got the chance to finish. You imagine that person pressing each glyph into the soft clay, one symbol at a time, moving slowly inward or outward. No one really agrees on the direction. It might have been a chant, a hymn, a set of instructions, or a prayer to a god who no longer answers. Some linguists believe the repeating patterns might suggest poetry or music. One particularly bold theory posits that the disk is an ancient songbook, the symbols representing notes or sounds for ritual chants. If true, it would be the oldest known example of a recorded melody. But that's a big if. Then again, everything about the Phaistos disk is a big if. Its very authenticity has been questioned. Some believe it could be a hoax planted by early archaeologists eager to find something sensational. But most experts who've examined it agree the material, the location, it all points to a genuine artifact. So why is there only one? If this was a writing system, where are the others? Tablets, scrolls, fragments. If it was a ritual item, why hasn't something like it shown up in other Minoan temples? The lack of context makes it feel like a broadcast from a single moment in time, a brief flare of intelligence that blinked out before it could spread. You run your eyes across the outer spiral again. The symbols don't look random. Some repeat in sequences hinting at structure. Others stand alone as if punctuating phrases, but no one's been able to read it. Not convincingly. Of course, plenty have tried. Amateur decoders, professional linguists, cryptographers, even artificial intelligence have all taken stabs at the Phaistos disk. Theories range from ancient Minoan myths to alien communication. Yes, aliens again. Some claim it's a calendar, others a mathematical puzzle. One even argued it was a pregnancy charm. The variety of interpretations is both impressive and hilarious, like trying to decipher a grocery list from scratch. Still, the disk holds you. Maybe it's the way the symbols seem familiar and foreign at the same time. Or maybe it's the spiral so natural, so universal, that makes you want to follow it to the center, hoping for meaning. But meaning doesn't come easily with the Phaistos disk. It's a riddle with no Rosetta Stone. A message in a bottle from a civilization that left almost no instructions. And that's what keeps people coming back. Because maybe if you look at it the right way, under the right light, or in the right mood, it'll open up. You picture it in its original setting. A temple, a shrine, a library shelf. Someone's hands lifting it carefully, reverently, using it to teach or chant or summon. You think about all the knowledge that's been lost over time. The languages erase the scripts that no one alive can read. And in that moment, the Phaistos disk doesn't feel like an anomaly. It feels like a survivor, a single sentence from a book we'll never read, a whisper in the shape of a spiral. And maybe that's enough. You step forward and find yourself facing a carved stone panel, weather-worn and modest in size. At first, it looks like nothing more than decorative flourishes, swirls, loops, a few classical figures etched in relief. But a small plaque beneath it reads something that grabs your attention instantly. The Shugborough inscription, an 18th century riddle that has never been solved. The monument stands in the gardens of Shugborough Hall in Staffordshire, England, nestled in a quiet patch of land once owned by the Anson family, naval heroes, aristocrats, collectors of oddities. But none of their possessions have attracted as much scrutiny as this, a pastoral scene known as the Shepherds of Arcadia, modeled after a painting by Nicolas Poussin, and carved just below the relief is a puzzling line of text. DOUOSVAVVM. 10 letters, no context, no spacing, no punctuation. Historians still argue whether this inscription is a religious message, a secret code, or an elaborate inside joke. Some believe it was left by the Knights Templar. Others think it's tied to the Priory of Sion. Dan Brown fans, you may now squeal internally. Theories abound. Perhaps it's a cipher, a Latin abbreviation, a Masonic ritual. Some have gone so far as to suggest it points to the location of the Holy Grail, but no interpretation has ever been proven. No document has ever been found to explain it. No diary, no sketchbook, no instruction manual from the original Mason. It simply exists. The most widely accepted guess, though accepted, is doing heavy lifting, is that the letters are an acrostic, the initials of a Latin phrase. One popular translation reads, Optimae uxoris, optimae sororis dulcis, amor vere amicitia, vivit memoriam, which loosely means, best wife, best sister, sweet love, true friendship lives in memory. Beautiful, yes, but unconfirmed. Another theory suggests the sequence is a cipher based on the Vigenère square, a Renaissance-era encryption method. And yet plugging the letters into this yields dozens of results, none of which are definitive. Even Bletchley Park codebreakers, yes, the very same minds who cracked the Enigma machine in World War II, once tried their hand at it. They walked away puzzled. The strangest part: the inscription appears beneath a classical image that depicts death. The shepherds in the scene point toward a tomb that bears the Latin words et in Arcadia ego, a poetic way of saying, even in paradise I am present with, I referring to death. You begin to see why people have gone a little mad over this. The juxtaposition, the heavenly landscape, the tomb, the cryptic code feels like something straight out of a secret society's initiation ritual. And maybe that's the point. You wonder, was the message even meant to be solved? What if it's a decoy? A red herring meant to distract? Or worse, what if it was solved and the answer was too dangerous to share? That's where the conspiracy theories flourish. Some believe Admiral George Anson, who oversaw the monument's construction, was hiding secrets gathered from his time at sea. Others connect the inscription to Francis Bacon Rosicrucians or the lost manuscripts of the Library of Alexandria. One researcher even claimed that if you draw a line from Shugborough Hall to various sacred sites across Europe, the locations trace the path of a hidden message. That's probably nonsense, but then again, maybe not. You gaze again at those 10 simple letters. 10 letters that have resisted centuries of linguistic analysis, cryptographic modeling, and even brute force computing. The panel itself has been restored multiple times, but the letters haven't faded. In fact, their precision suggests they weren't added casually. They were etched with intention. And what about the double V? Is it a WA Roman numeral 2 US? The possibilities multiply faster than the solutions. One fringe theory suggests the inscription is a mathematical formula encoded with ancient Pythagorean wisdom. Another posits that the sequence is actually musical notation, 10 notes arranged to form a melody. A few brave souls have tried to play it. Results haunting. No one knows if it was meant to be read aloud, sung, or simply stared at until its meaning sinks in. And maybe that's why the Shugborough inscription has endured. It's simple, elegant, cryptic without being chaotic. It's not just a puzzle, it's an invitation. An invitation to dig, to guess, to connect dots that may not even exist. And in doing so, it draws out something very old in us, the urge to solve the unsolvable, to pluck order from mystery, to whisper secrets back into silent stone. You take one last look at the monument. The shepherds are still frozen in their stone tableau, their gaze fixed on the tomb. The letters below them remain unchanged, untouched by centuries of storms, visitors, and wild theories. Dousvavvm. You won't crack it tonight. But that's okay. The mystery you realize is the message. By now, your eyes have adjusted to the gloom your mind trained to spot the strange and the undeciphered. So the next artifact should be familiar territory, yet it hits differently. You're now standing before a language, not just a script on a tablet or a phrase scrawled in ink, but an entire system of writing, and no one alive can read a single word. Welcome to Rongorongo, the forgotten script of Easter Island. And yes, it really is as mysterious as it sounds. When you think of Easter Island, you probably picture the massive Moai statues, those solemn-faced giants lined up like they're waiting for something. But while the Moai get all the fame, Rongorongo might be the island's true mystery. Because unlike most ancient writing systems, this one didn't come from trade routes or colonization. It seems to have developed independently. That's a big deal. Historians still argue whether Rongorongo is the only known example of a writing system that spontaneously arose in total isolation. You lean in to look at one of the surviving tablets. The script is mesmerizing, tiny, precise glyphs arranged in rows, each one carved with obsessive care. The figures seem to represent people, plants, animals, tools, some recognizable, some not. The lines are arranged in what's known as reverse boustrophodon, which means that you read one line left to right, then rotate the tablet 180 degrees, and read the next line in the opposite direction. It's dizzying, and kind of brilliant. There are only about 24 Rongorongo artifacts left in the world. Most are carved on wood, sometimes driftwood. A few are fragments. Many were destroyed during the colonial period, lost to firewater or neglect. The surviving ones are now scattered across museums in Europe, the US, and Chile. Not one remains on the island itself. The tragedy of that isn't lost on you. You think about the scribes, if that's what they were called, etching out these lines with shark teeth, candlelight flickering, trying to preserve something. A prayer, a law, a love poem. No one knows. Some believe Rongorongo was primarily sacred, used only by the priestly class to record chants, genealogies, or ceremonies. Others think it may have been practical cataloging harvests or celestial observations. And yet, there's no Rosetta Stone, no translation, no bilingual tablet. Just this elegantly looped writing flowing across the wooden grain like a language you almost understand, but just can't quite catch. Some glyphs repeat in patterns hinting at structure. Others appear only once, like secrets whispered and forgotten. A handful of researchers have tried to assign values to the glyphs, comparing them to Polynesian spoken language. Others think Rongorongo wasn't a full writing system at all, just mnemonic devices, memory triggers for oral traditions. But here's the kicker. If Rongorongo really is a form of true writing, it would be one of the only known cases of a literate society in all of Polynesia. And that changes everything. It means that Easter Island wasn't just a remote outpost, it was a cultural powerhouse. A civilization capable of constructing megalithic statues and encoding their history in glyphs. It suggests a level of intellectual infrastructure we didn't think they had. But then, it vanished. By the time Westerners arrived in the 18th century, Rongorongo was already slipping away. Missionaries discouraged its use. The old elite, those who could read and write, were either killed, enslaved, or died of disease. Within a few generations, the knowledge was gone. No one can even pronounce Rongorongo, let alone read it. You pause to imagine what's locked inside those glyphs. Did they record how the Moai were built? Did they explain why the trees were cut? The soil eroded, the population collapsed. Do they contain the islanders' own voices, witnessing the end of their world? Or perhaps they're just songs, lullabies, lists of fish. There's something poignant about not knowing. Because here's the sad truth, there may be no one left to remember. The last people who understood Rongorongo may have died before the tablets were ever studied, taking the keys to this strange script with them. You notice something else now. Each glyph is carved with such precision that they almost seem alive, like the figures are moving, gesturing caught mid-sentence. It's writing not as static text, but as dance or music. One scholar likened reading Rongorongo to trying to decipher a jazz performance from sheet music if the sheet music were encoded written backwards and half the instruments were extinct. And still the glyphs wait. Researchers have turned to computers feeding digital scans into pattern recognition software, hoping for a breakthrough. Some progress has been made, repeated symbols, possible grammatical structures, but we're still far from unlocking its full meaning. Others argue the path to understanding lies not in machines, but in revival. In giving the people of Rapa Nui, the true name of Easter Island, access to the glyphs so that cultural memory might stir. That, maybe just maybe, someone will feel the meaning before they fully understand it. It's a long shot, but not impossible. You step away from the tablet and notice something haunting. The Moai statues you passed earlier. They were erected to watch over the island, but the Rongorongo tablets, they speak from within it. Not guardians, but storytellers, and maybe one day they'll be heard again. By now, the mysteries should be blurring together like a dream you almost remember. But the next exhibit jolts you back to attention, not with its size or age, but with its audacity. Because what you're looking at isn't ancient stone or forgotten script. It's a human skull, perfectly smooth, seamless, and entirely made of quartz crystal. You've arrived at the infamous crystal skulls, objects so controversial they sit at the uncomfortable intersection of archaeology, pseudoscience, and Hollywood imagination. You've probably seen them before, or at least heard of them. Carved crystal skulls most about the size of a human head, with features eerily realistic. Some are jawless, others have movable mandibles, and all are said to have been discovered across Central and South America, often attributed to the ancient Maya or Aztec civilizations. But here's the twist: none of these skulls have ever been found in a documented archaeological dig. Historians still argue whether the crystal skulls are ancient relics, 19th century curiosities, or outright hoaxes. The most famous skull, often referred to as the Mitchell-Hedges skull, is perhaps the crown jewel of the mystery. Named after British adventurer F.A. Mitchell-Hedges, it was supposedly discovered in the 1920s in the ruins of Lubantun, a Maya city in Belize, by his adopted daughter, no less. It's a good story, too good in fact, because there are no excavation records, no field notes, no photographs of the skull at the site. In fact, it didn't appear in any writings or photographs until Mitchell-Hedges tried to auction it off decades later. Experts from the Smithsonian and the British Museum eventually got their hands on similar crystal skulls. Using electron microscopy, they found evidence of modern tool marks, the kind made by 19th century rotary wheels, not ancient obsidian blades, which makes the mystery even more maddening. If these are fakes, why are they so good? Crystal is notoriously hard to carve. It fractures easily, and these skulls, especially the Mitchell-Hedges one, are carved against the natural grain of the crystal. That's risky business, even with modern tools. So how did they do it? And more importantly, why? Some believe the skulls were created in Europe in the 1800s, a time when fascination with ancient Mexico was booming, and wealthy collectors were eager to buy exotic artifacts, real or not. Crystal skulls made perfect conversation pieces, beautiful, creepy, and supposedly magical. That's where things get even weirder. Because the myth of the crystal skulls doesn't end at archaeology, it explodes into the realm of the paranormal. According to New Age belief, there are 13 original crystal skulls, each imbued with ancient wisdom or extraterrestrial knowledge. When united, they will supposedly unlock hidden truths or protect humanity from apocalypse. Sound familiar? That's because this lore inspired books, documentaries, and even Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Yes, that movie. But let's not hold that against the artifacts. The skulls themselves are mesmerizing. You stand before one now, lit from beneath by a faint blue light. It gleams like ice, but feels heavy with meaning. The empty sockets stare out as if watching you. One fringe theory posits that the skulls are ancient data storage devices using the crystalline structure to encode vibrational energy, essentially a mystical hard drive. Others claim the skulls can focus healing energies or that they produce visions when meditated upon. And while there's no scientific evidence for any of this, people believe. They gather, they chant, they pass the skulls hand to hand and claim to feel warmth tingling, even hear voices. There's something about that belief that makes the skulls powerful, whether or not they're authentic. And then, of course, there's the Maya themselves. Some of the carvings on the skulls echo Mesoamerican motifs, but no Maya texts or artifacts mention crystal skulls. No temple inscriptions, no buried examples, nothing. It's as if the legend was reverse-engineered, planted onto an ancient culture to give it weight. But still, you ask who made them. If they were crafted in Europe, who had the skill? Crystal carving of this quality was rare, expensive, and risky. And to do it with enough realism to fool museums, that takes more than just artistry, it takes audacity. You can almost picture it. A dusty Paris workshop somewhere in the mid-1800s. A craftsman hunched over a chunk of Brazilian quartz, whispering to it as his tools grind down the edges, smoothing jawlines, hollowing eye sockets. Not to fool anyone, maybe just to create something haunting. And somehow that haunting worked. The crystal skulls have outlasted their supposed origins, their critics, even their creators. They've become modern myths, tangible, visible, but no less mysterious. And maybe that's the lesson here. It's not whether the skulls are real in the archaeological sense. It's that they've become real through our curiosity, our belief, our desire to hold the past, even if it's carved from imagination. You stare again into the sockets of the Mitchell Hedges skull. The light shifts, casting a faint shimmer through the clear quartz. It doesn't blink, but for a moment you wonder if it could. You're nearing the end now, your senses wrapped in layers of wonder, like gauze around an ancient relic. But just as your mind begins to drift, the final artifact pulls you back with a jolt of surreal beauty, something so strange, so imaginative, that it blurs the boundary between genius and nonsense. Laid out under soft lighting is a massive book, thick, heavy, bursting with color. The pages are brimming with illustrations of impossible plants, alien alphabets, machines with no clear function, and people performing rituals that don't exist. This is the Codex Seraphinianus. Not a relic in the traditional sense, this one's not thousands of years old. It was created in the late 1970s by Luigi Serafini, an Italian architect and designer. But its presence among ancient mysteries is no mistake, because the Codex isn't a parody. It's not a joke or a collage of random ideas. It is quite literally a world. Every page features hand-drawn imagery that echoes the logic of biology, anatomy, physics, and culture, just twisted enough to feel alien. Think flowers growing into eyes, or human-animal hybrids lounging on unnameable furniture. There are pages that seem like catalogs, anatomical studies, product advertisements, and cooking instructions, all rendered in exquisite, nonsensical detail. And then there's the writing. Yes, the Codex is written in a flowing, elegant script, but the language doesn't match any known system. It looks readable. It feels like you should be able to sound it out. But every symbol is invented. The alphabet has never been deciphered, and Luigi Serafini himself admits there's nothing to decipher. Because he didn't design a language, he designed the illusion of one. Historians still argue whether the Codex Seraphinianus is art literature, a visual novel, or something entirely new. When pressed about the meaning, Serafini said he wanted to replicate the experience of a child looking at an encyclopedia before they can read, when the pictures mean something, but the text remains untouchable. In that way, the Codex becomes a mirror of our own early experiences with knowledge, a reminder of how much we want things to make sense. And yet, the Codex resists you. Every time you think you've grasped a concept, the next page takes a sharp left turn. A seemingly clear diagram of metamorphosis person to fish to cloud suddenly gives way to floating furniture surrounded by cryptic measurements. You flip back and forth, trying to link the pages into a logical chain, but there's none to find. And strangely, it doesn't frustrate you. It frees you, because the Codex is one of the few texts that demands absolutely nothing from you. No interpretation, no understanding, no history degree. It exists purely as sensation, as an act of joyful confusion, and yet people have tried to decode it. There are entire forums dedicated to uncovering patterns in the script. Some have built fonts to replicate the alphabet attempting frequency analysis. Others try to reverse engineer the logic behind the illustrations. If this is a faucet and this is a person turning into fruit, maybe this whole chapter is about agriculture. The guesses are usually wrong, and Serafini smiles quietly as he watches the world chase shadows through his labyrinth. But here's where the Codex becomes more than just a curiosity. It has depth. The longer you sit with it, the more it reflects our own species back at us. Our need to classify, our obsession with catalogs and instruction manuals, our ability to assign meaning even where none exists. It's the Codex as a museum of the unreal. You imagine a future where the Codex is the only surviving artifact of our time. What would archaeologists make of it? Would they assume it was a holy text, a technical guide, a legal codex, or would they too be enchanted and baffled? That's the real power of the Codex Seraphinianus. It pretends to be decipherable, but only so it can show you how much you want to decipher. It draws out your hunger for meaning, only to gently chuckle and lead you into a garden of surreal delights. And the artwork, let's not forget, is stunning. Every page is hand-colored. The style ranges from medieval manuscript to modern schematics, sometimes reminiscent of anatomical studies, sometimes like IKEA instructions from another dimension. There are maps of landscapes that morph mid-page alphabets written in candy-colored ink and what looks suspiciously like a universal calendar made of dancing worms. You're not sure if you're reading dreaming or hallucinating, but you're not alone. Over the years, the Codex has inspired artists, musicians, writers, and dreamers. It's been the subject of art shows, academic essays, and even AI simulations trying to replicate its visual logic. There's no other book like it, and perhaps there never will be. Because to create something like this, to pour years into building a universe with no reference point and no meaning, requires a kind of creative bravery most of us can barely fathom. Serafini worked on the Codex for about 30 months, from 1976 to 1978, in a state he described as a trance. No publisher asked for it. No audience demanded it. He just did it. And now, decades later, his strange, luminous book has earned its place among the greatest unsolved artifacts, not because we can't read it, but because it dares to ask. Why must everything be read? Maybe some things should just be felt. You close the Codex with reverence, like laying a sleeping child back into its cradle. It doesn't need decoding tonight. It needs dreaming. And that, in the end, is the perfect way to close your journey. From ancient cities swallowed by sand to disks, no one can translate to maps of the sky that chart nowhere real. You've walked through a gallery of unanswered questions. But it turns out answers aren't everything. Sometimes mystery is the gift. And now, as the last page drifts closed and the soft hum of the night settles in around you, let your breath slow. The flicker of torches fades. The stone corridors vanish. The echo of cryptic scripts and ancient whispers dims into silence. You've wandered through ruins no one remembers building, touched relics no one remembers crafting, and peered into the eyes of skulls carved from crystal. You've stood beneath forgotten skies, followed languages that slip through your fingers, and stared long enough at nonsense to see meaning bloom. And still you're here, safe, curious, dream-heavy. The past is never truly gone. It lingers like smoke in old pages, or footsteps in sand just before the tide comes in. Sometimes it's loud like a crumbling temple. Sometimes it's quiet like a string of letters no one can read. But it always waits. and tonight it waited for you. So let the stories soften now. Let the monuments return to shadow the artifacts to their velvet-lined cases. Let the questions remain unasked, unanswered for just a while longer. There's comfort in not knowing, in letting the unsolved stay that way. Because some mysteries were never meant to be conquered. They were meant to cradle us to sleep. So rest now. Let the hum of ancient memory rock you gently like waves against a long-forgotten shore. The world you came from will be waiting in the morning. But for now, sink softly into the unknown.